That was The Police. I'll be watching you. My name is Jim Bredos. I'm your host on The Radical Imagination. I'm a sociologist who's taught at John Jay College and Yeshiva University here in New York. And our guest today on The Radical Imagination is someone I met at the recent 50th anniversary conference at Columbia University on the Columbia Student Rebellion of 1968. She's a remarkably gifted and articulate spokesperson for a field that has become increasingly important for progressives and activists around the world to understand and appreciate. Nikita's a civic technologist and data privacy activist in New York City, graduated from Columbia with a degree in history and statistics, and spent her free time organizing and crafting progressive policy with the Roosevelt Institute. She has interned for the Tor Project, the leading privacy browser used by activists and dissidents throughout the world, and she currently works at the NYU's GovLab, examining digital platforms that increase participation in the lawmaking process. At the conference, Nikita blew me and others away with her knowledge of a field probably most of us in our audience have a lot to learn about, including myself: our rights of privacy as citizens. In Carpenter versus United States, a pending case before the Supreme Court, the Trump administration's position would mark the end of privacy in the digital age. The specific dispute concerns whether the government needs a warrant to obtain records of the cell towers that an individual's phone is connected to over the course of several months. The data allows the government to construct a map of everywhere an individual traveled 24/7, as long as he or she was carrying the phone. The administration argues that because we voluntarily give this information to our cell phone service providers when we use a phone, there is no Fourth Amendment protection for it. By that reasoning, all information shared digitally, including emails, web searches, and the internet sites one reads or views, would become an open book for the government. It would end privacy as we've known it for the past 200 years. I'm so glad Nikita's here on the show to enlighten us and help us fight back at those who would crush our privacy and dissident rights. And before we meet her, here's a brief clip by Glenn Greenwald on why privacy matters.
There is an entire genre of YouTube videos devoted to an experience which I am certain that everyone in this room has had. It entails an individual who, thinking they're alone, engages in some expressive behavior: wild singing, gyrating, dancing, some mild sexual activity, only to discover that, in fact, they are not alone, that there's a person watching and lurking, the discovery of which causes them to immediately cease what they're doing in horror. The sense of shame and humiliation in their face is palpable. It's the sense of, this is something I'm willing to do only if no one else is watching. This is the crux of the work on which I have been singularly focused for the last 16 months, the question of why privacy matters, a question that has arisen in the context of a global debate enabled by the revelations of Edward Snowden that the United States and its partners, unbeknownst to the entire world, has converted the internet, once heralded as an unprecedented tool of liberation and democratization, into an unprecedented zone of mass indiscriminate surveillance. There is a very common sentiment that arises in this debate, even among people who are uncomfortable with mass surveillance, which says that there's no real harm that comes from this large-scale invasion because only people who are engaged in bad acts have a reason to want to hide and to care about their privacy. This worldview is implicitly grounded in the proposition that there are two kinds of people in the world: good people and bad people. Bad people are those who plot terrorist attacks or who engage in violent criminality and therefore have reasons to want to hide what they're doing, have reasons to care about their privacy. But by contrast, good people are people who go to work, come home, raise their children, watch television. They use the internet not to plot bombing attacks, but to read the news or exchange recipes or to plan their kids' Little League games. And those people are doing nothing wrong and therefore have nothing to hide and no reason to fear the government monitoring them. The people who are actually saying that are engaged in a very extreme act of self-deprecation. What they're really saying is, I have agreed to make myself such a harmless and unthreatening and uninteresting person that I actually don't fear having the government know what it is that I'm doing. This mindset has found what I think is its purest expression in a 2009 interview with the longtime CEO of Google, Eric Schmidt, who, when asked about all the different ways his company is causing invasions of privacy for hundreds of millions of people around the world, said this. He said, if you're doing something that you don't want other people to know, maybe you shouldn't be doing it in the first place.
Maybe we shouldn't be doing. Welcome.
Hi, thanks for having
Nikita
me.
Singareddy to the radical imagination.
Yes.
And we want to talk about the way in which America is hindering our privacy rights. And I know you're an activist. You've been involved in various programs and research on all of this, and you were just absolutely fantastic at the Columbia Conference and just blew us all away. So tell us a little about your work, your interest, how it hooks into some of the things we're interested in understanding.
Well, I think just being a young person and always having a cell phone or a computer around me, the idea of digital privacy has always, to me, just been part of my fingerprint, part of growing up. We assume that we have privacy in our own homes, and that's something reaffirmed by the Supreme Court, albeit someday, speaking of the case Carpenter, do you actually have all of those privacy rights afforded to you? But it should be natural, right? As an extension of yourself and what you do, even though online is a digital space and real life is I guess, the normal space that we occupy, there should be extensions of the privacy we are afforded in real life to the digital sphere. And I think
Makes
that's
sense.
exactly, it seems like something that would make sense. But it's interesting you brought up privacy in America, because a lot of other countries have the idea of privacy even is preposterous. In England, for example, CCTVs are everywhere. And I grew up in Australia, and the idea of privacy there is, and in most countries, is somewhat modern. Brandeis talked about privacy back in the early 1900s, and there have been people who've hypothesized that maybe privacy came out of, and this is more of a Marxist, leftist thinking of privacy, this idea of wealthy people who had servants being able to withdraw into their private quarters away from everyone else, like their servants or whoever was out on the street. But when you really think about privacy today, it's not just, I don't want people to know what I'm doing, but it's, how can I be a creative, decision-making being in charge of my own life without having to worry that someone's going to be stifling that expression?
Which is what Greenwald is bringing. Right.
Exactly.
So you assume that you can have this life, but now there's big questions as to whether or not you can, as a result of the Trump administration's decision to cut down on some of that rights. Is that?
Yeah, I mean, even as far back as the creation of Internet 1.0, so let's say in the 1980s, Lawrence Lessig and a lot of Harvard Law scholars were writing about the Internet and the Internet 1.0. People had embedded in that notion an idea of a decentralized world where it's not just controlled by one government sovereignties and their laws, but rather this is this new phenomenon, this new space where we can we can create whatever we want and we can be whoever we want to be. And Internet 1.0 very much was that. But then it was, and I think a lot of that is embedded in who created the internet. A lot of it was researchers, they were hobbyists, technologists. And then when Internet 2.0 came about, that was when you got your Googles involved, the larger corporations who started seeing how can we.
When was this now?
So let's
1990s
is
right.
when,
Okay.
and then the big tech boom and
Right.
Tech bust of the stocks back in the early aughts. But that's really when you had a lot of companies coming in and trying to monetize, figure out how can we use the internet as not just a communication tool, but how can we build and allow streams of information to go. Exactly. And so the internet we have today is really that corporatized internet. So there is nowhere that you can really go on the internet unless, I would say our technology, even the privacy technology we have out there isn't perfect yet, but basically wherever you go, there is a footprint being crafted of who you are online. And whether that's super tethered to reality, that remains to be seen, because it's not as if you have a self-sovereign identity saying, this is who I am online. They are creating it based on this kind of patchwork of where you go online, your cookies. If you said yes, you can have my information. If you said no, then oftentimes you don't even know if you said yes.
Right.
So they
keep following you for a variety of basically economic reasons.
Yes.
Which can also turn into political.
Yes.
How so?
Political. Well, of course, especially if you're an organizer, especially in exactly in any country that surveys, the United States, of course, but most countries. And the unfortunate thing is, even going back to that case, Carpenter, they don't need to know exactly what websites you're visiting, or they don't need to know exactly who you were meeting, but rather the metadata involved. So even how long you spent on a website, or how long you were in a given space, because they can pinpoint it on GPS. That's enough information to create a case against you. And then a lot of these cases around surveillance are heard by the FISA court. And the FISA court doesn't have the normal oversight and transparency that the traditional legal system make. It's supposed to be private and hidden so that people don't know if there's a case being brought against them.
Clandestine, secretive stuff.
Yes, that is essentially what the FISA court does.
Scary. Sounds very scary, right? Or should we be that scared? Or
I don't think I wouldn't say it's a reason to be scared, but it's certainly a reason to say, this is not, when we set out to make this amazing technology, the internet, it was never meant to be a tool to be exploited in this way. And there are enough people out there, whether they're sociologists or technologists, policy people, who believe in that vision. And in the last even couple of years, you've seen blockchain technologies, or the idea of encryption being used in how we communicate with one another. And basically, encryption in layman's term is just the idea of, instead of what I'm saying to you and where I said it being passed through a node, and that node being accessible to anyone, your nodes are layered in levels of protection. And only you and the device you are communicating with know how to unlock that message. So that's kind of what we have right now as a form of privacy. So when you hear about Telegram, that's what Telegram uses. Tor has a more complex version of that as well. It encrypts enough information in multiple nodes to be able to pass your message or your activity along.
So that's the protection that you then have. That you have to be sophisticated enough to carry this on. Otherwise, you're open to the market here. And whatever that decides, that the corporate interests decide to do with it. Right? So
even Tor, which a lot of people use, there are millions of downloads.
Tor is now, tell us again.
The Onion router. So and Onion, because of
Take
layers.
Take it slow here. Me
and
a lot of the audience here, you're just, you've got all this.
I'm firing away.
No, fire away. No, you're very clear. So Tor is
the Onion router.
Onion router, okay.
Yes, and they're headquartered in Seattle, but a lot of them are in Boston, and now a lot of their engineers are basically around the world who work on this. And it's a lot of them are volunteers who have created this browser that you can use. And the reason it's called Tor, or the Onion router, is because of those layers of encryption. It's not as fast as a normal internet if you were just using Chrome or Internet Explorer, because it does take time to send your traffic or your activity from one node to another node to another node. And exit nodes are basically where your IP address gets located. So instead of being here in New York, for example, your IP address shows up as I'm in the country of Georgia, or I'm in Ethiopia somewhere. And exit nodes is where your information is still a little bit vulnerable, because you don't know who is owning that exit node.
And your role in all of this is what? You, in terms of activists and dissidents and your work at Tor and now and
GovLab,
GovLab at NYU, how does that fit in? What are you actually pursuing or doing that's...
So part of it is obviously to create a community of people who care a lot about surveillance and privacy and want to further build out these tools so that we get from where we are now, which is probably 75% where we want to be, to here is a fully private device that you can use to communicate with your friends and family or anyone.
And you're safe.
And you're safe.
And it was your political viewpoints, your attempts to organize and so on.
Exactly. And so that's really from my privacy background, what I'm pursuing. Then at GovLab, that's really about civic engagement. So I guess I got two sides of the activist in me. One is I want to make sure everyone is safe and secure. And the other, how can we enable you to take that expression on the streets, expression online, and action it in government.
And pursue it and get people around the issues that you want to.
So I can tell you a little bit about what we're doing at GovLab.
Please.
The specific project. Now, GovLab does a lot of different things around civic engagement for networked institutions and how we can use various technologies to further that. But I specifically work on a project called Crowd Law, and we are trying to come up with best practices and identify the really great projects and initiatives out there being run by governments, usually at the local level, and civic organizations alike, that help you get involved in the lawmaking process. So when you normally think about how a law gets made, where do people play a role in that?
Getting people mobilized. And raising consciousness and getting the word out there.
So, but usually, that happens at the beginning. So like, I want, you're a lobbyist organization or you're an activist, how do you convince your lawmaker to put out a bill? It's usually right at the beginning of the process. Then you don't really see anything that happens in between until here's the bill, we're going to vote on the bill.
It happens, right.
So how can we get involvement in between? And countries and cities have done an incredible job at creating platforms. So Better Reykjavik, for example, in Iceland, it allows people to upvote proposals on certain ideas that they want to be covered, whether that's like immigration or even schooling, et cetera. And then once a proposal gets enough votes, then it's institutionally required to be seen by the city of Reykjavik, which is really incredible. That's just one example. Then in the drafting process, instead of just your representatives drafting, is it possible for citizens to co-draft with them? And there is an example called WikiLegis in Brazil that allows people to co-draft bills with their lawmakers. So these are really tangible examples of activism.
And you really believe this can be done in this country where so many, particularly young people, have given up on the two-party system and really affecting any substantial structural change. But you're saying that's still possible.
I think it's definitely possible, especially you're speaking a language that they understand, which is technology. Now it's not necessarily easy. You're not always looking for the easiest solution, but rather what's a meaningful solution. And I think a lot of these platforms, we can look at their efficacy abroad to see what might we be able to bring back here. And participatory budgeting, for example, which happens in several districts in New York. I think a lot, more than 20.
In New York?
In New York.
Okay.
Basically, a budget or a portion of your district budget is allotted
in the city?
In the city,
okay.
At the district. So for example, District 8, District 8, Mark Levine's district, they portion 1% of the budget or something. I think it's something, I'm not sure how much it is.
For whatever, and as a result of listening to the constituents.
They vote, so basically the
participatory democracy.
Yes, the constituents, exactly. They come up with, this is the idea we want this money to be apportioned to. And then there's voting. So you decide, instead of a representative, exactly where that money is allotted. And it's been very popular in New York, Boston, lots of other places.
And the representative actually pays attention to this because it could mean winning or losing.
And people feel like they get a say. For example, there are specific events to get people to come and participate in participatory budgeting that are for specific underserved communities. So there's one for people who, in this district, for example, people who are formerly incarcerated. They said, come out, create proposals around usually brick and mortar things that you want to be seen, that you want done, and have a say and build out this proposal with us. We'll help you co-draft what it could look like.
For example, like,
Spanish speakers.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
They do it for Spanish speakers, even children. They have
So
had it.
closing Rikers
Yeah.
prison, how would that operate? Run us through that. Take us through what that could possibly happen. In terms of some sort of political solution and participation, communities and so on. And the power structure and all the ideologies behind that, and not in my backyard, all that sort of stuff. It gets complicated, right?
Yeah.
Don't you meet at times very, very heavy ideological resistance, not only in this city, but around the country over such things as voter suppression laws and so on.
Yeah.
So take us through that, because it sounds wonderful.
Yeah. Well,
at first glance
I think that there are very interesting, and this is very, you really have to have an imagination to believe that we can do some of these things,
That's the show.
right?
Radical imagination.
Right. So
we're having it.
Exactly,
Okay.
right now. And there are people that are doing this, so that's what makes it.
Okay, it's real. It's not just an imagination.
Exactly.
Okay.
In Colombia, I believe, is where this project exists. It's an app, essentially, where you can see this is the bill that's being proposed, and you can tell it's more of your virtual vote to indicate to your representative, this is what I'd like you to do when you vote on this topic. And out of this app, I believe it was called Citizen OS, but if I'm wrong, I will let you know. They created a party, a literal political party called the Net Party. And they said their pledge was, if you elect us to the government body, we will vote based on what you tell us on the app. If you and the bill comes forward and you virtually tell us, we approve of this bill, and I see there's more yays than nays, I'll vote with the people. So it's very responsive government versus I elect you every 4 years and I think you're doing what I want you to do.
Let me be provocative. Okay, so let's say we have the people don't want to loosen voter suppression laws, or they want Rikers to continue and let pile more people in there. Now what?
Oh.
No, where does the activism go? The technology is there, but it's still sort of a give and take.
Yeah, definitely technology will never supplant activism.
Right, so it's a matter of getting out there and organizing and mobilizing people and changing people's minds.
Yep.
And the technology can help us
empower
be
that.
A venue for that to happen.
Yeah.
Okay, all right, but again, there is resistance, and would you argue that there are some very powerful vested interests who will fiddle-faddle around with this technology, say, well, let them play around with this, but I'm going to vote this way anyway, because the big money is really telling me, well, so now what?
That's why we need
we need social movements?
We definitely need social movements.
So
but we
poor
also,
people's campaigns and stuff like that to be out there and be part of this dialogue, because it ain't going to happen as you're describing it here. The fundamental
this is in a perfect world if our representatives were always responsive to what we wanted and we were able to
good,
intervene.
kind,
exactly,
bright people.
Yes, and we were able to intervene at any point in the lawmaking process beforehand to make sure that the opinions of people are heard and then actioned.
I got you.
But
it's important.
It's important.
It's very important.
So one of the great things I've seen from the projects I've looked at, a lot of them are institutionalized. So this is another example. Brazil, for some reason, is at the forefront of a lot of this, but they have I guess it's more of a program. It's called Promise Tracker. And in a lot of Brazilian schools, they're supposed to abide by a certain standard for what they're feeding children. But a lot of places don't. So in conjunction with the Chamber of Deputies in Brazil and some civic orgs, they decided, let's create a way for kids to take photos of their food so that we know whether those schools are maintaining those standards. It's a way even to get kids involved in evaluating how effective public policy is. And it's done a really good job, because if they get a couple photos that kids have sent in and they can say, that's definitely not what you're supposed to be feeding children. The Brazilian government, local government, is able to send in not necessarily representatives, but send in people to engender change within that smaller school. So even
Things get exposed
exactly.
and get out there. Yeah, I see what
Yeah.
you're saying. Okay.
There are examples of in Finland, or actually Denmark. Denmark's a better example of this. They have a place called Mind Lab, which was run by the Department of Education and another department to get people and businesses and government leaders to come together and run pilot programs. So if you think, I want to create a different kind of policy for healthcare, or maybe something smaller than that, because it might be a little bit radical to just pilot. Something small. They want to see, let's pilot this in an area and see how it works. And if it's successful, let's scale it out to the rest of the population, because we know that we can build a true policy around this. So there's examples of that going on.
Yeah, no,
and it's looking at.
But don't you need a fairly sophisticated group of people able, willing to participate in this? I mean, is that sort of a semi-given?
Yeah, for all of it, it's volunteers. You need volunteers. You need a government that cares and will provide funding for it. You need a lot of researchers and academics, of course, are always involved in things like this. Even businesses that are around urban design or things like that, they get involved in a lot of these processes. But it does require an active and engaged citizenry. None of this matters if that is fundamentally missing.
And of course, it forces the country that would not like to see that. And
exactly.
So, and try to repress your efforts to do this. So, is that what we're getting back to here in terms of, with every breath we take, there are efforts to shut these sorts of programs down, or regulate them, or make sure that they don't have the sort of power that you want them to have?
I think if people don't buy into the idea that they can enable change, then the government barely looks at these projects. They go, no one really cares, no one's really invested in them. But sometimes the government themselves drives the project, sometimes it's civic organizers, but if there's enough noise, if there are enough people that say, this is a really great project and we care about making sure that we have better schools, we have better immigration, we have better healthcare, we have better roads, whatever it is, and they can point to this at, like 311 data, for example. If they can say, this 311 data is telling you we have so many potholes in our city, and you're not fixing them, that makes me angry. There we go.
So
there's a reason for activists.
Right.
Yeah.
Get people out there.
Yeah.
So let's maybe take something broader, a social movement which we've talked about before the show here, Poor People's Campaign, which I've been involved in, and we every week have a segment on that, and I've been down in DC the last couple of weeks and participated in direct action there and so on. Now this is an attempt to resurrect what King was attempting to do back in '68, so the attempt to rekindle that energy by organizing and getting hundreds, not thousands of people to participate at state legislative levels and at DC, in the Capitol and so on. Getting people there and getting people to demonstrate and to take action. And in the hopes of spreading that word. So every Monday there is a direct action. 3 o'clock happens simultaneous, civil disobedience, mass demonstrations, etc. First time in our history that that's really happened. Now, if you will, I guess the strategy, the gamble is to make this enough of an issue, get it out there as a narrative, that we begin to pay attention to poverty and the linkages to racism and militarism and excessive materialism and so on. Now, as a movement, you want this to spread. Now, how can the technology be used in ways that can get that narrative out there, that this can become something that literally millions and millions of people participate in, and turn the tide against the military prison industrial complex and so on, the power elite?
Well, of course, one of the great things about having social media is that you can take really potent imagery and help it go viral. We saw that with Black Lives Matter and that photo of Letitia James. I've seen Rev Barber.
Yeah,
even just a clip of him speaking, he is so riveting.
Unbelievable.
Right?
But there was no, as far as I can tell, there was no national media outlet that was down there in Washington to capture what was going on there.
So the good thing is there is great leftist media, but if we want everyone, especially like you said, mainstream media, to pay attention, it does mean you have to go viral. You have to have enough people with a hashtag or enough people who are sharing a video. I think a lot of it is trying. This is something that I still haven't figured out. How do you capture exactly on social media?
You mean they didn't teach you that at Columbia?
No, they missed that.
They missed that. Okay, well, okay. So now you got to figure it out. All right.
Yeah, it's trying to take technology that already speaks to so many people, and then imputing within that a message about poverty. And I think a lot of it is I think it makes people uncomfortable. Yeah. The idea of let's talk about class, let's share a tweet or let's post on Facebook about class issues. It definitely makes people uncomfortable because who you are online is a very cultivated persona. So you have to say,
absolutely,
this is an issue that matters to me, and I'm going to be tweeting about it and sharing and writing about it because this issue is so important, and be willing to do that and continuously do it, because activism isn't episodic, especially not for a huge issue like this. It has to be sustained.
And this is going to be a multi-year effort.
Exactly.
No, I'm thinking about a particular example at last week's rally in which had a number of people from various parts of the country talking about the suffering and the pain and what they've gone through. And there was one woman in particular, I think she was from Alabama, who lost a child because lack of medical care that the state wasn't providing, and so on, and she didn't have access to it. And she just started crying while she was on the stand there, and just said, "Forgive me, I just have to let this out." And she let out this unbelievable wail from the bottom of her being. And it was, Reverend Barber just said, if you all feel like wailing also and feeling that, what she's feeling, go ahead. And it was one of the most electric moments. I mean, I've been around the block a few times, but man, this was something else.
Yeah.
I mean, that moment, to capture that, I mean, this is a viral moment. And there's we're going to see, actually, I'll have a couple clips toward the end here on Barber's, and the face-to-face interaction that he had with a particular police officer, one of the Capitol police officers, was just, again, riveting. You could see the searing anger and venom in this guy's face. And I mean, that's the sort of thing you're talking about, right? That needs to go viral, and people can begin to get out of their little cubby holes and see what's going on, right?
Yeah, and a lot of that comes down to, other than people going out there and being there in solidarity, being part of the movement,
which is
the SEIU
difficult,
of course. The SEIU did this fantastically, I thought, with the Fight for 15 at the Service Workers International Union.
Yes.
Okay.
They,
for the Fight for 15 movement in New York, they always had someone out with a camera, or someone out with a video, so then they could capture those moments when they happened. And because they had such a big network of people that were in solidarity with them or other activist organizations, those would go viral. They would spread everywhere. And it's unfortunate that these bottlenecks exist around what kind of media, as in what kind of mainstream media you can get to your events. Because at first, when the Fight for 15 were doing their demonstrations, it's not like any mainstream media at all came about. But because, people already know, or at least hearing more about the Poor People's Movement. And that's a really great place to start, because once those actions continue and they're sustained and they're as electric and they have those moments that you were talking about, people will start showing up or continue to show up, and so will the media, because the media will follow wherever the people are. And people know Reverend Barber, for example. You always need to have those incredible figures that's it's always a part of having some of the movement go viral specifically.
And last week had Jesse Jackson there also, who was the original mayor, as he put it, of the reservation, the tent city that was being constructed in '68 there. So it's important to see that link and so on. Yeah, I agree with that. But once again, you have that energy. That's another question. Where does it go? Does it go into a political party? I mean, into laws, and how does that go? But we're still at this level of getting the technology and the media to pay attention. and
Yeah.
getting people to understand what's going on too.
Yeah.
That's a very important component of that. So tell me a little about your Columbia experience. I mean,
Sure.
this is, did you pick up a lot of this during your studies, or how did this all happen? Because I've read some of the stuff that you've been writing, and you wrote for the Spectator, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, you were quite active, and well, obviously still are, but how did this happen on campus? Tell me a little about your own experiences there. And what's going on there now?
Still, yeah, okay.
Still the struggles,
Right.
and the unionization.
Yeah. I would say
Workers and
my coming of age in
Yeah.
my politics
Yeah.
I didn't strike myself or see myself as a leftist until senior year. And I think a lot of that was around the election. So obviously awful event, but I think it really galvanized a lot of people that were coasting by, that were satisfied in their politics. This was a moment that shook a lot of us.
And Columbia keeps you very busy, obviously. You got to study.
You have school.
So you have
right.
school, and you
school
have
and
papers.
Yeah,
Obviously,
you have papers.
It's a tough place.
Right, but there was all those moments of action that you do participate
Okay.
in, whether that's fighting for divestment, being in solidarity with the unionization efforts on campus. Those were always things
That's right there in front of your
exactly,
face. Yeah.
exactly. And then when Eric Garner and all of the Black Lives Matter shooting happened, that really created the movement. A lot of people were out on the streets shutting down highways. So I remember that junior year is something I was a part of, and a lot
Columbia
of other people.
too.
Yes,
Right.
and at
Okay.
Columbia.
Me Too? The Me Too movement?
Me Too, of course. We have
Okay.
Title IX, Emma Solkowitz and her mattress, of course, this really viral, it went viral
What
with
did
her
you make of that?
performance art.
Tell me your thoughts on that.
Well, I think it's very interesting to hear her talk about it, because she said, I didn't set out to become an activist, but it's a mantle, it's a thing that she has to shoulder, because her story brought out so many other stories for other women on campuses, not just at Columbia, but across the country. And I'm really glad it happened, because we wouldn't have had, this big Title IX campus sexual assault movement that now we've seen, or the Me Too movement that happened in Hollywood and has continued to have a reckoning in so many other industries. That's kind of what you want out of a movement, for it to not just be isolated and circumscribed to one area, but say this is a systemic issue.
And you get caught up in that actually in your junior year and so on? Or?
Yeah, I would say not. I
More.
personally didn't participate that much in any of the Title IX activism, and I think that's because I actually spent a lot of my time for Fight for 15. So that's the thing about being an activist. You kind of, especially when you care a lot about one issue, but you also, obviously, as a woman, I care about being safe and and having the space to be a feminist. But for me, I gravitated towards the activism of Fight for 15, so I spent a lot of my time there.
Why did that naturally happen?
It's just someone who reads a lot about labor and labor history. I took a class with Eric Foner around the American radical tradition, and I saw this resurgence of labor activism. And of course, it's New York, so there's always going to be those kinds of movements, but on campus, I'd never seen anything like it.
Right, and I'm just a little personal. I mean, is there something within your family background that would bring this out too? Because at the conference, we remember from talking about the activists of '68 that there was number were from families of Holocaust survivors, for example. I mean, was there something in your own background, personal history, family history that maybe, or not,
that.
maybe?
My parents are immigrants, so immigration policy has, I would say, mattered to me. They have been a part of the managerial class, so not necessarily laborers, but I've been to India. I've seen, especially it's funny because after the IMF and a lot of, I guess, India moved towards neoliberalism, we saw in that moments as well a stripping back of workers' rights for these new corporations that were coming in, and the IMF and the World Bank basically gave the check mark to those policies in order to get funding from them for grants and for building more infrastructure. So I've seen some of the negative effects.
Even though, in fact, your family their condition improved under these sorts of policies. Is that I mean, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I think.
But then you could see it for what it was too. So
Yeah.
it's a conflicting sort of thing.
It is. It is.
Because you are part of a privileged,
Right.
and now what do you do with that?
Exactly. I feel lucky that my grandparents actually were teachers.
Yeah.
So they always came from there's just a pure educational background. It wasn't like they were working at a corporation or any kind of business.
Right.
So for them, all that they matter, or what was most important for them, was the way that my parents were being raised and being educated. But my parents have never really been activists. They don't pay attention that much, other than, what is Donald Trump doing?
But your grandparents, that was
my
hardcore.
grandparents were, yes. My grandparents
Same
were
with
teachers.
mine. Same with mine. From the old country.
Yes.
Yeah, Russia and all that.
Yeah.
And Greece too.
Yeah.
So.
It's actually really interesting. In India, they have, in one state, I can't remember if it's Rajasthan or if it's another one, the two parties that it goes back and forth between the Communist Party and the Socialist Party. So that's as far, that's the only two parties that really have a stronghold in India. So very eclectic political system in India right now.
Do you get back and forth? Do you go back and forth? Or?
I go maybe every 3-4 years. So I don't go as often. I'm not as plugged in as I'd like to be. So I guess it's kind of hard to track down where it was sparked in me, why I decided to become more of an activist and channel more of my energy on doing that. But I think it just happened from reading a lot and observing. When you see the pain and suffering and the material conditions that people face in this country, you can't turn a blind eye. You can't say.
No, I hear you. I hear you. No, I understand totally. I mean, it's very understandable. It's very admirable. I relate to a lot of what you're saying there. So, what are some of the other issues on campus now? You have there's debates about these controversial speakers coming to campus, and I know you've written about that too, as well, right? I mean, what's your position on that?
So I have
free speech,
right?
We shout people down. What's going on in campus there? We want Ann Coulter's and her ilk on. Do we listen to her? What are the students? What are
I
they
would
saying?
say you're welcome to invite whoever you want to campus.
Yes.
And we are activists are just as welcome to go and protest those speakers. And that is the important parry and thrust that has to exist. Especially because I think politics is about power and having those power struggles, and visualizing it is just as important as physically just debating it when you're hanging out with
And the
someone.
protests should take the form of what? Is it?
Oh God, that.
I mean, listening and vigorously debating and or not allowing them to speak.
This is
blocking.
It's still something
entrance.
that I have to personally figure out. But I think some ideas are so dangerous they don't deserve to be articulated, because just by articulating them, you validate them. And you're saying that this is an idea that is worth debating. It's worth hearing out. Like when Charles Murray says African Americans have inferior IQs and are just not as smart as white people. That's based on some very questionable race science.
But shouldn't we be, the slippery slope there, of course, is who's going to decide what ideas are really the dangerous ones, and should we listen to him and
debate those ideas?
and
Well,
protest and get back.
He came to campus, right?
And get back at what he's saying.
Exactly. So there were
fight back in that
activists
way.
out there. There were activists in the audience, activists before he got in, and it's really important to always have those people there to say, you might listen to what he has to say, and that's fine, but it's really important to recognize the falsity that's embedded in his words, and also the dangerous consequences that come out of, even if one or two people in power say, yeah, that idea I care about, I think is true.
And if it's so offensive, does that justify having, what do you call it, safe places, or allowing students to understand that this might happen and this is something they may not want to listen to, or should they? What do you think should the policy be on that sort of stuff?
I wonder what Columbia's specific safe space policy is, if they do have one. But I think it's about having spaces where you're free to express yourself. And there are some places that just have innate chilling effects to them that you don't feel like you can fully be yourself. And you can even take the workplace, for example,
Right.
as a space that you can't fully be who you are and who you want to be because there are policies in place and there are norms in place about expressing who you are. And that manifests itself in so many other contexts. When you're in a classroom, you can't just say or do whatever you want because it's a classroom. And it's the same, it's that idea. So when I think of safe space, I don't just think of it as, oh, I want to hide from this idea that I don't like. I don't see it that way. I see the concept of a safe space as an empowering environment, especially for communities that have been underserved and systemically oppressed.
And developing sensitivity to what they've experienced. I get it. I can't, but we have about a minute left.
Oh, no,
No,
that's it?
I mean, because we had this couple of clips on Reverend Barber and this last week, the events down in Washington, D.C. So I admire and respect so much your vigor, your energy, your intelligence, and your activism and so on. I think this has been really helpful for our
Thank
audience.
you for inviting
Well,
me.
we have a few more. So any way of reaching you, or what? Any last words here in the last 30 seconds you'd
Yeah,
like to?
I can definitely be found on Twitter. You can just Google Nikita and I will pop up.
Okay.
My other advice would be to download Tor, download Telegram, secure means of communication.
Okay.
That should just be something that everyone does.
Okay.
And secure email, Thunderbird is an example of that. Just be vigilant always and be an active. Be vigilant and be an activist.
Be a vigilant activist. I
Yes.
can't thank you enough for coming.
Of course.
This
Thank
has
you for
been
inviting
terrific.
me.
Thank you, Nikita.
Thank you.
And thank you so very, very much, all of you, for viewing The Radical Imagination. This is Jim Vredos, wishing you a great week. And we're going to go off with a couple of clips from Reverend Barber and the Poor People's Campaign down in Washington, D.C., ending with a short little clip of people demonstrating and getting arrested. And if you look closely, yours truly will be part of that entourage there. So anyway, all the best. Vigilant activism.
Yes.
Thank you again so much, Nikita.
Thank you.
And thank you all so very much. See you next week on The Radical Imagination.
Today, in more than 30 states and here in the District of Columbia, activists, clergy, and most of all, impacted people, poor, will be organizing a nonviolent, moral fusion direct action Mondays, a direct confrontation with what we call policy violence. And the immoral policies that we see are continuing to hurt the poor, and particularly the focus today will be on women in poverty, children in poverty, and the disabled. We cannot continue to have a democracy that engages in the kind of policy violence that we see happening every day. I think about the low-wage worker I met in North Carolina who could not get insurance because North Carolina did not expand Medicaid and was also sick with ovarian cancer, and has children. Or Amy in West Virginia, who's a woman, who's working poor woman, who watched her state, her governor, Republican governor, cynically give a little raise to teachers, but chose to do it by cutting Medicaid and cutting food stamps. Or I think about the lady Pamela in Loudoun County, Alabama, who has raw sewage in the back of her yard, who was taken advantage of by predatory lenders and had to pay over $100 and some thousand for a single-wide trailer that is now falling apart, full of moles and holes. And her son, who's 11-year-old, now has to wear a CPAP machine because of the infections in his lungs, and she herself is disabled. All over this country, we continue to see what is not often seen or talked about in our politics, in our political debates, or even in the media, except for places like here, Amy. 250,000 people are dying every year from poverty and low wealth. 64 million people work with less than a living wage, 54% of African Americans. And these realities hurt children and women and the disabled the most. Thousands of people who are homeless of every different race, creed, color, and sexual orientation. And what we are saying, it is time for a moral confrontation, a nonviolent moral confrontation, because whether you look at the morality of our Constitution, the establishment of justice. Or you look at the morality of the scriptures that says, for instance, in Isaiah 10, woe unto those who legislate evil and rob the poor of their right and make women and children their prey. It is immoral to have 37 million people without health care. It is immoral not to pay living wages when we know we can do it. It is immoral that people don't have single-payer health care for everybody as a matter of human rights, and children have access to public education and college, and that we stop the trend of resegregation. It is immoral the way we've suppressed the vote in a way that allows people to get elected who, once they get elected, using racialized methods to do so, they then vote policies that hurt women and children and disabled. They're against living wages. They're against health care. They're against unemployment. And those things that hurt families, hurt children, hurt women, and hurt the disabled. And we're coming together of every race, creed, color, kind, people from every part of this country. There will be simultaneous nonviolent actions beginning today with a 2 o'clock rally and then 3 o'clock direct action, and this will go on for 40 days every Monday, along with other things that will be happening across the country.
What is that direct action, Reverend Dr. Barber?
The direct action will today, after the rally, we will link arms, clergy in full vestment with impacted people, and today we will, under the theme, somebody's hurting our people, and it's gone on far too long, and we can't be silent anymore. We will take a particular street right near the east side of the Capitol, and we will engage in that street. Many people will sit down to pray and lay, because we are saying that the country is headed in the wrong direction. That's why today it's the street. Later on, it'll be other places in D.C., but today it's the street, because we're saying the country is headed in the wrong direction. We have to break through the moral narrative. Our first goal is to break through the moral narrative to where we're talking about, we're not even talking about these issues in the country. And we're also going to be calling people to engage in massive voter mobilization. And we're also going to be doing power building among poor communities. And this, Amy, is a launch. The 40 days is not the end of the campaign. It is the launching of a multi-year campaign.
We're trying to go to independence. And we won't keep walking. We want to go to independence. We want to go to independence. We want to go to independence. And it's gone on far too long. And we won't be silent anymore. And we won't be silent anymore. And we won't be silent anymore. Health care. What do we want?
Health care.
When do we want it?
Now.
Health care.
Health care.
What do we want?
Health care.
When do we want it?
Now.
Living wages.
Living wages.
What do we want?
Living wages.
When do we want it?
Now.
Children.
Children.
What do we want?
Children.
When do we want it?